Hello and welcome to Between the Spires. Today we have a very important interview with one of the most senior figures at the University of Oxford. Chris Patten is our Chancellor, but before that he's probably best known for being the last Governor of Hong Kong, a Tory MP, an EU Commissioner and Chair of the BBC Trust. So normally when he says something, it hits the headlines. Let's go meet him. Lord Patten, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Delighted.
So, I think we can talk a bit about politics, what's going on at the minute, the different problems. You know, the last time we spoke was a year ago, and a year certainly is a massive time in politics now. But there's one question actually that a lot of people have been asking me to ask you. And that would be, if you were doing a speech in party conference, what would your song be?
Well, the first thing I think is that I would reckon very hard about whether or not to make it Waterloo. But the trouble about Waterloo is the result of Waterloo was that we won. And I'm not sure this is a winning policy or strategy at the moment. So I'd have some difficulty. For some of the delegates, I might have to do money, money, money.
It doesn't have to be ABBA though. If you
doesn't have to be ABBA? Oh, gosh. No, I think I'll stick with the reverse of Waterloo.
And if you look at then, you know, the actual speech itself, there's lots of things in there you can unpick, but just in terms of what came from that, what was your general assessment of it? Because party conferences have lost their sort of steam now.
Until I went to Hong Kong in 1992, I'd had to go to every party conference, I'm amazingly old, from 1967. And since 1992, with great enthusiasm, I haven't been to one. I don't think that party conferences are the greatest fun, and I think they invariably bring the worst out of politicians. I mean, when you think of some of the speeches made this year, there have been some great speeches at party conferences by both Conservative and Labour down the years, but I don't think on the whole they show politics at its best as an honourable adventure. I don't think they take policy issues seriously. You think this year of Jeremy Hunt, who's a perfectly intelligent fellow, he's no fool. After all, he got a first at Magdalen, I think it was Magdalen, suggesting that the EU was the same as the Soviet Union. I mean, how can a serious person make a speech like that? It's so sort of vulgar.
And as I said, a year since obviously you'll remember, a year since we last spoke.
I remember it every night. I go to bed and think about it.
Yeah, and I obviously remember it as well. But as I said, a long time, lots of things have happened. What on earth has happened since I last spoke to you a year ago?
Well, it's all become, as was predicted, a bit worse. When you look at the international scene, whether it's Trump or Brexit, or Russia, or Western Asia, the Middle East, it all looks worse. And here, it's predictably worse. The latest economic assessment, and the Brexit debate isn't all about money, but money matters. The latest estimate is that if you look at our sort of doppelganger economies, people have looked at 22 of the economies that are like us, OECD, and they've done, since Brexit, a good 2.5% better than we have. And the argument which people put perfectly reasonably is we're probably now 2.5% poorer than we would have been if we hadn't had that Brexit referendum. And that's before we've actually left the European Union. So we're already talking about not just relative decline, but at least for a period, absolute decline. And on that basis, we have to actually deal with so many of the social problems that affect us today, whether in the public services or on the streets with knife crime and so on. I think it looks pretty awful. I mean, I sound a bit like Eeyore when I say all that, but unfortunately it's true.
So what can you do then? What do we do? Because, you know, I remember you said it in 2016 before the referendum to Newsnight, you said your fear was that we'd have a never-endings from the Leavers if they lost, which is what you could argue they wanted.
Certainly if Leave had lost, they'd have been immediately saying it wasn't fair, we need another referendum. So it's rather rum that they've now turned around and they're saying, oh, we couldn't possibly have another referendum because we've decided this forever. I'm against referendums. I've never voted for a referendum. I think they contradict the whole notion of parliamentary democracy. But I think that if Parliament can't actually decide what sort of deal it wants, we may well fetch up having another referendum in order to sort it out. And I think if there was another referendum with people given a choice of whatever the deal on the table is, of leaving without a deal or of staying in, I think they'd probably vote to stay in. And
linking back to Oxford then, just because there's been a lot of things in the press. When you read an article about somebody from Oxford, a critical article, especially opinion pieces, it'll sort of do the typical sort of privately educated, maybe Oxford educated, insinuating really that this is the elitism, as they're an elite person and they don't understand real concerns. And there's been debates as well in the Oxford Union about has Oxbridge failed this country and so on and so forth. But what do you make of that? Because every leader we've had, really, most leaders have been Oxford or Cambridge educated. Obviously, you could argue that it's an individualistic thing, not an institutional thing. But it can't be really a coincidence that all of our leaders are at the same place in this university, and it seems to be going wrong, and it has been going wrong for a long time, especially now.
Well, if you look at most societies, you find the people that get to the top in politics or civil service or business have been to a rather limited number of the best institutions, of the best universities. You think of the number of people in the United States who've been not just to Yale, but Yale Law School. I was interested in some of the discussions around the Kavanaugh appointment about the number of people who were involved in one way or another, other judges or the head of the FBI or whatever. All of them had been contemporaries at the Yale Law School. It's part of what happens in any society. Invariably, not always, but invariably, the people who get to the top have been academically doing the most challenging things when they're 18, 19, 20. What is odd is here we are at Oxford, whatever methodology you use, one of the best universities in the world, and people use it as a stick to beat us with. I mean, there aren't many things in the world we do better than other people. And there are one or two football teams that are seriously elitist, like Manchester City, but that's done with overseas foreign players. But our higher education system, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, UCL, King's, and others, is probably the second best in the world. And it's amazing we're so good because we don't spend as much on it as other people do. So, but instead of celebrating that, we constantly rubbish ourselves.
Why is that then? I
don't know. It's a sort of national characteristic, I think. I mean, if we win a football match or a cricket game or rugby, within 48 hours, people are actually pointing out that we weren't really as good as we thought we were. It's not something you find in other countries.
And then looking still at that sort of Brexit debate and Oxford students, because you and the Vice-Chancellor sort of represent Oxford students on the larger scale in ceremonial matters or, commenting on things. We sort of talk about how lots of young people, the majority of Oxford students, would be Remain voters. This is our future, it's going. What do you think you can do, or what would you say to Oxford students actually about the situation now? What can you do? What can they do?
I think it's terribly important that people who feel strongly about political issues don't give up on them because things go wrong for a bit. So I think that people who feel very strongly about Remain and regard their future as being compromised by the vote to leave shouldn't give up, but should go on arguing and working for what they believe in. One of my worries is that my generation is going to bequeath to yours a much less good and a much more difficult future than you should have a right to expect. I've lived during, in many ways, the most prosperous and peaceful period in British history. I've lived through a period where this country in lots of ways has become fairer and more tolerant. Though I think now it's starting to lose that a bit. I think there's an increasing resentment about foreigners, about abroad, about immigration. I think an increasing tendency to blame other people for what goes wrong. But I think by and large, if you compare attitudes to sexual preference, to women's role in society, to race, now with what it was like 40 or 50 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago, things have greatly improved.
Is that decline going to happen then? Is it sort of a tipping point? Because it seems to be, is that it is, yes, I would never sort of have lived through what you lived through in the sense that, society wasn't as tolerant 50 years ago if you were gay, if you were even black or whatever. But it just seems as if we're at a tipping point now with things like, Brexit, which is, as you said, has brought up the role of migration and changed people's attitudes and changed sentiments towards other people. Is that surely it's a sort of a lose-lose for everyone?
Well, I think there may be a tipping point. The other day, the Foreign Secretary, who is one of ours, the Foreign Secretary made a speech saying that the Brexit vote, the Brexit nationalism, wasn't the same as populism in other countries. And then went a couple of weeks later to a Conservative Party conference and made that speech which I referred to earlier, in which he compared the European Union to the Soviet Union, which was the sort of awful populism you get from Salvini in Italy, or you get from the National Front in France. I mean, at the same time, conservative members of the European Parliament declined to vote to condemn the Orban government, which is anti-Semitic, which advocates illiberal democracy, presumably because they thought that we could use Mr. Orban as an ally in our Brexit negotiations. It can be complete piffle, but sort of dishonourable. And when that sort of thing is happening, it does make you a bit worried about the future integrity and decency of public debate.
Surely, you mentioned that example with the Foreign Secretary, surely that's because they don't actually believe in anything in the first place?
That may well be the case. I mean, there are some politicians who do believe in one thing, which is getting on. Well, not
in your day, surely. More in your day, it was more to do with principles, integrity. Obviously,
I hope so. Not always, but the first boss I had was a man called Peter Carrington, who was Defence Minister.
Lord Carrington, yeah.
Lord Carrington. He died this summer, and it's said that he died with a seraphic smile on his face because somebody had just told him that Boris Johnson had resigned. He was 99. He was, of course, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but all of us get a hand of cards from the start, and some cards are higher than others, and life is about how well you play them, whether they're low cards or high cards. And he played his hand brilliantly. He was brave. He got an MC in the war. He was a wonderful natural leader. He was honest. He was decent. He was immensely courteous. He had all the qualities of chivalry, which I hope haven't died on the vine. I mean, Edmund Burke, at the time of the French Revolution, said the age of chivalry was dead. Well, it was in terms of clanking armour and white shire horses, but I think that things like decency and honour and valour still matter.
And finally then, we've mentioned advice you'd give and what you should do in politics and what you should do and you believe in. I'm sure that we'll have a chat again before I leave. This is my final year, so don't worry, I will come back.
God, thank goodness for that.
No, but what would you say then to people that are, it's the students behind us here in the Bodleian, they leave Oxford. We've painted sort of a very varied picture of the world internationally, with domestic issues at Oxford here as well. What would you say to people leaving in whatever they're doing? That honesty, that decency you talked about, is that something that...
I think I've got a sort of old-fashioned message, which is a bit like my speech at prize givings, which has travelled the world now. It's been delivered on almost every continent. The theme of which is success is not enough. I mean, I think that it's terribly important when people have had, I talked about getting lucky cards, when people have been dealt a terrific hand, you're bright enough to come to a good university. Maybe your background has helped that, but maybe it's just your own personal efforts despite your background. But you've been here. Not many people have this sort of advantage, and it's really incumbent upon you when you leave to put back into society some of what you've taken out because you've been here. I've been very pleased over the years that Oxford produces the largest number of graduates who do teach first in the country, which is just one example of people who are putting back in something they've taken out. So I think it's very important that people recognise that, whether it's in public service or in other ways. But one of my youngest grandchildren has just gone to a choir school, and they had a lesson from their chaplain the other day, and the chaplain said to them, don't fret about exams, don't worry about any of that. He said, the only thing I want is when you leave, love people. It seemed to me, and particularly Jesus. So when you meet him, you'll know how to love him. And I just thought it was a wonderful thing to say to 7-year-olds, love people, and it's rather unsophisticated, but
we do a bit more love in the world.
Yeah. Perhaps my favourite song should have had love in the title.
There we go.
Love, love me do. How about that?
Lord Patten, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there we have it, Chris Patten's favourite song, what his views are on Brexit, as well as what his advice is for Oxford students when they leave the university. I think what this shows is that even though we do criticise our senior university figures, rightly or wrongly, we should be listening to them, and that's because what they say does affect us.